All right, welcome to one of our lunch talks for the Center for American Architecture and Design. I'm Brian Norwood. I'm one of the board members of CAAD. And today, delighted to introduce my colleague, Dr. Tara Dudley. She's an assistant professor here at UTSOA, teaches, as most people know, in interior design and architectural history, working on the kind of contributions of African American builders and architects to the American built environment, really looking like over the 19th century into the early 20th century and further into the 20th century, gets to the present. And then one thing to say is that Tara wrote a book a couple years ago, or published a book a couple years ago called Building Antebellum New Orleans, Free People of Color and Their Influence, which has won, I think, a number of awards that you can't even account. You can't count them at this point. Like, it's just a very well awarded book. So delighted to see all these other projects that Tara's working on, including an essay on the Caribbean that she still owes me for an edited volume.
On that note, I think
We gotta
we
go.
should go now. No.
Volunteered to do this section. Anyway, so Tara's part of her in-progress work includes a biography of the life and work of the African American architect John Saunders Chase, who is so incredibly important to our school. So delighted to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so this particular project is outside of my normal wheelhouse, since I'm definitely a resident of the long 19th century. But it's been interesting to actually make some ties back to there, which I'll talk about briefly. Thank you all for coming this afternoon on a Friday. It's quite lovely, so it would be awesome to be outside, so I won't keep you. But I'm glad that y'all could join me here today. So I typically arrive on campus very sleepy and caffeine deprived following my 6 a.m. drive from Kyle. And although my arrival time was a little later in the spring of 2019, the circumstances were quite similar. After checking my mailbox and grabbing my classroom key, I tried to dodge all other human interaction as I sprinted down the hall through the dean's suite when I was quite surprised by our former dean, Michelle Addington, running out of the back door of her office and asked if I had a moment and she could speak to me. Surely I was in trouble. I hope that was not the case. But her inquiry took me off my rocker, really, and immediately cleared the rest of my sleepiness and the cobwebs. And her question was, would I be interested in meeting with the Chase family to discuss writing a book on architect John S. Chase? I don't think I let her finish her sentence, as I immediately yelled yes. And she's like, wait, are you serious? Yes. And she's like, okay, we'll continue this conversation. For me, it was really a no-brainer, given Mr. Chase's importance to not only the School of Architecture, but to American history, to American architectural history, based on a life and career of numerous firsts and accolades. But it was also personal, since I had received a Chase scholarship a couple of times during my graduate studies here at UT. And so then began now quite a bit of a journey to researching the life of Mr. Chase, his career, as I embarked on this book project. And so today I'm really happy to share with you my work. This spring, celebrating 100 years of John S. Chase exhibition is, of course, important because we are commemorating what would have been Mr. Chase's 100th birthday this year, but it's also an opportunity to share some of my findings since 2019 as I complete my writing. It's been a long haul, thanks to a global pandemic, academic and professional obligations, as Dr. Norwood just let us know, and the raising of 2 teenage girls. I have a hard time saying no, and people know this about me, but it's all for good things. And I do hope to complete or submit my completed manuscript to UT Press by the end of this semester, knock on wood. All right, so by chronicling Mr. Chase's life and achievements, my intention is that this biography follows the trajectory of 20th century American architectural history, as well as African American history, through a chronological examination of Mr. Chase's personal life and career. I'm interweaving the story in about civil rights and education and other areas of African American life, the state of the architecture profession in the United States and its gradual inclusion of African Americans, and also the development of Austin, Houston, Dallas, and other urban environments in Texas and throughout the United States. So my in-depth examination of Chase's life and the broader contextual study afforded by the chronological manner in which I'm structuring my book is augmented by relevant anecdotes, quotes, as well as visual material, including but not limited to family and professional photographs, architectural drawings, newspaper articles, correspondence, and various ephemera. And so much of my early work, and amongst the earliest work, and I guess I was doing this research not realizing that I was going to be researching a book on Mr. Chase, especially with the Chasing Perfection exhibition that was mounted first in Houston at the Houston Public Library, and then here in our very own Me-Bain Gallery in the School of Architecture. And I literally went around and took pictures of almost everything in the exhibition, which was a good initial catalog of the work that I embarked on. So I kind of knew what I was going to be expecting once I did start researching in the collections where Chase material is housed in Houston. And so we have those of his professional material, namely drawings, and not drawings for everything, but a significant number housed at the Houston History Research Center, which I think is the new name of that institution in downtown Houston. And then more of the personal and family papers and photographs are housed in the portion of the collection that is archived at the African American Library at the Gregory School. So I also started doing newspaper research, combing through interviews that had been conducted with not only Mr. Chase, but his wife by Greg Smith, who is the former director of the National Register program at the Texas Historical Commission, but also teaches the National Register course here in the School of Architecture. Media interviews that I listened to, as well as conducting interviews with Mrs. Chase before she passed away, former colleagues of Mr. Chase, including Darrell Fitzgerald and Robert Morris, and looking through things like the AIA files. Very early on, the connection that Professor David Heyman had made with the Chase family helped with my work, especially after his publication with Stephen Fox of the book on the Chase residence. So I had some really good foundation to begin this work. The AIA files were also extremely helpful and really instrumental in helping me to begin to build a catalog of Mr. Chase's works, especially since essentially there were the same, dozen or so, or maybe 15 projects that would be listed over and over again in articles about Mr. Chase's life and career. And so I was quite delighted that the AIA Historical Directory has online archives. There are several components of that, including a membership file, a biographical file, and an awards file. And so being able to pull information, and over time, the AIA would solicit information from its members, including, like a resume of projects that you've worked on, and taking some of those documents, I was really able to expand Mr. Chase's output and that of his firm to 300 plus works. And if you've visited the exhibition, we have, I think, about 75 of those listed on the panels in the north lobby of Goldsmith Hall. And so that was really exciting to be able to do that. And one of my classes was the fall 2020, 2019 or 2020. I saw pandemic brain, I don't remember things. Like when stuff happened, took on a project when mapping, because I have like no GIS talent whatsoever. And they asked if they could take on mapping Mr. Chase's works that I had identified. So that was quite helpful and will be a fantastic contribution to the book. Although I do have to update it with properties that I've discovered with ongoing research, with things like Texas Historical Commission pursuing projects, Section 106 work, National Register nominations of properties that were affected by hurricanes over the last decade or so, and every now and then through their research on some of these properties, Chase project pops up, or through the research of colleagues like Stephen Fox and others. Did you know that this other building was a Chase building? And I'm like, nope. And let's add it to the list. So it's been quite rewarding. But going back from the main time period of his life, and when he was able to really start having an impact on the architectural field, it's been equally rewarding to understand more about Mr. Chase's background, his family history, even to the point where I was discovering things about the family history and their contributions that his children didn't know, that Tony and Sandria were unaware of as well. So that was quite exciting when I finished the drafts of those initial chapters and being able to send those to them and to Ms. Drusy as well, to help fill in some blanks. And so in these early years, going back even to the last quarter of the 19th century, understanding that Mr. Chase's family had origins in Winchester, West Virginia, or Virginia, Jonestown, Pennsylvania, before his family ended up in Annapolis, Maryland, and knowing that his great-grandparents had attended college at Storer College, for example, and you can see catalog pages from there that are listing students, and that included the names of family members. And they were really instrumental members as educators, especially in freedmen's communities, early Black communities in some of these locations. And so it was really nice to be able to kind of create that foundation for Mr. Chase's life and work, and ultimately his significant contributions to African American history and architectural history. And so the first chapter of the book talks about that family background and chronicles Mr. Chase's boyhood in Annapolis. I think this photograph he's around 9 years old here, and I love, and the black and white image of the two kids was just pasted in a scrapbook in the archives in Houston, and that's Mr. Chase and his older sister. And all these kinds of things made just, his story more real to me. But this first chapter chronicles his boyhood through his graduation from high school, exploring his family life, his upbringing and education, in addition to any builders and contractors with whom Mr. Chase had contact with early on in his life. I'm also researching the Annapolis firm on West Street, where he first encountered knowledge of the profession. He recalls, just walking by this architect's office and being really intrigued by what was going on in there. And so he walked in and was invited in to kind of look around and speak to some of the draftspeople. And also just, to talk about some of the architecture that Mr. Chase was exposed to in Annapolis, particularly in the predominantly African-American neighborhood in which he lived, and the manner in which civic leaders and educators promoted the development of the built environment for the sustenance and preservation of that community, because of course all of these events and individuals really impacted Mr. Chase's later pursuit as an architect, even from the kind of vocational studies that he engaged in high school, and some of those professors who were also very instrumental in his life. And so my next chapter will chronicle the years after Mr. Chase graduated from high school, including his service in the U.S. Army, really emphasizing his attendance at Hampton Institute. And for those of you who have taken or sat in on any of my classes, you know the importance of both Hampton and Tuskegee as preeminent African-American universities that taught the building trades in a vocational way to African Americans, but how many of the earliest professional Black architects in our country were students and graduates of those institutions, and also just impacted the building trades and architecture in significant ways. And so this Hampton really offered Chase and, of course, other African American students and African American men who were interested in the building trades an opportunity for advanced study that they were not able to pursue in other ways. This chapter also explores, in a more broad way, the history of educational opportunities then for African Americans, especially those wanting to pursue a profession in architecture. And here in this slide, I have images from Hampton Institute's archives of some of the kinds of vocational building architecture related courses that students were taking. We have students in the middle top who are learning how to make bricks and then to build with those materials. The vocational programs at institutions like Hampton and Tuskegee really were focusing on hands-on knowledge, and the students in those programs understood building and construction, and throughout Mr. Chase's career, this becomes a through line, a thread, and we understand just how important actual building and construction was to his work. The image below that shows some students in a drafting class, a drafting studio. And then the image at the top right is Mr. Chase's graduating class. And we have Mr. Chase in the bottom right with his sister, Laura. His studies at Hampton were interrupted by his service in World War II. And so I'll highlight and chronicle that in this particular chapter as well. He served overseas in the Philippines and received several commendations as a result of his service. And it's fun to look at those photographs, but even to see the kinds of buildings on and off base that he had access to. He kept a scrapbook from his time there. And so there are a number of photographs from there. And then, of course, on the left, we have an image of Mr. Chase in his cap and gown upon his graduation from Hampton Institute. The next chapter focuses on Mr. Chase's time here in Austin. It's funny to hear him recount his decision to come to Austin or down south or to the deep south, as he called it, because initially upon his graduation from Hampton, he had a position with an architecture firm in Philadelphia as a draftsman, but quickly realized that this was not going to help him progress with his desire to become a professional architect. And so he wrote back to Hampton Institute, which had a fantastic job placement program, apparently, and decided that he did want to go down south for a number of reasons, one of which was, of course, with the economy, the success of the economy in the U.S. South, particularly as a result of the oil industry. Understanding that there were institutions or groups like longshoremen's groups who needed buildings, they needed clubhouses and headquarters and things of that nature. So he understood that there would be a good clientele from a growing working and middle class in the South. And so they wrote back and offered him a position teaching architectural drawing at a vocational school for African Americans here in Austin, the Crescent Institute. He talks about coming off the train, and it's probably August, September, so it's hot, as you might imagine, upon his arrival here in Austin. And so this chapter will really explore his exposure to architecture in the South and to Austin's African American community. Here in Austin, Chase was employed by prominent African American building and real estate company, Lot Construction Company, or Lot Lumber Company, as it's also called, which offered him an opportunity to build buildings. And I think people, if they think about Mr. Chase in Austin, and so it's automatically the University of Texas and his very significant enrollment here, but he was actually in Austin for a year or so before that happened. He was working for Lot Construction Company, and here in this spread from John Mason Brewer's sort of history of Austin, there it is. In 1951, this spread was devoted to Lot Lumber Company. It's a family-owned business, and so these are all members of the Lott family. But here at the lower left is John S. Chase working in that office. He also, for a time, engaged in a partnership with Herbert Buckley, who was a native of Laurel, Mississippi, but who had also come to Austin seeking opportunity. And they worked together for a time. And you can see their firm, as you might call it, Modern Building and Designing Company. And they had an office on East 11th Street, so right in the heart of the Austin's African American business district. Early on, he also worked, he did some work for the Crescent Institute on their building or buildings. He also worked on expanding and renovating a hotel for African Americans, the Deluxe Hotel. And here we're looking at an earlier and then later, or this is the earlier one, and then later additions that were done by Mr. Chase and Mr. Buckley for that proprietor. Maybe even more important, he courted the love of his life, Miss Drusy Rucker, and it was really fun hearing not only his account of their courtship, but hearing Miss Drusy talk about it as well. She was on the verge of graduating from Tillotson Institute, now Houston Tillotson University, so still pretty young at the time, and she caught Mr. Chase's eye at the wedding of her cousin, Mr. Chase, and I think the roommates in his boarding house were asked to sub in as groomsmen for the wedding because the groomsmen were involved in a car accident on their way to Austin. Everybody was okay, but they weren't going to get here in time. And so the bride's mother went to his boarding house and was like, hey, we need some guys to step in. And they did, and that was very fortuitous for them. And initially, she kind of brushed it. It's really hilarious hearing them talk about it, especially Miss Drusy, who was a very graceful and reserved person, but she would get this look on her face and a twinkle. She was great to hear her talk about it. And he tried to date her at first, but I think she told him this one time, I think he asked her to a football game or something, maybe. I can't remember at this moment the exact event, but she was like, no. But then I think he saw her there and was like, hey, wait a minute. And ultimately, he was persistent, but got in good with her dad over their mutual love of baseball. And so that's kind of like how he got in good. And, they decided it was okay for him to date Miss Drusy. And so they courted and married a few months, weeks really, after his enrollment at the University of Texas. And so bringing just, those real life stories and just very personal stories into this narrative has been really fun and rewarding as well. But understanding that Mr. Chase had a significant contributions and just, was a part of Austin's Black community even before his enrollment at the University of Texas. And to hear him tell it, he wasn't really aware of the Sweat v. Painter case that was going on. He was living in Austin, working and trying to find a way to pursue a professional career as an architect. And so ultimately, or initially, he contacted Hugh McMath, who was the director, I think, of the School of Architecture. They didn't call him the dean yet at that time. And so he's pursuing work as a draftsman, working for Lott Construction Company, in this firm that specialized in home building for African Americans. But he knew he needed an advanced degree. And so he inquired about, just maybe taking some classes on the cool at UT, of course, which was segregated at the time, maybe sitting in on some classes, essentially auditing them, and met with Mr. McMath, who initially asked him to bide his time, understanding that with what was going on with the Sweat v. Painter case, and ultimately that would probably work in the favor of Heman Sweat, and then therefore open graduate programs to African Americans, which was exactly what happened. So Mr. Chase's timing was quite fortuitous. And in 1950, the Supreme Court ruled against segregation in three separate civil cases, including Sweat v. Painter, which specifically related to Mr. Painter wishing to enroll at the University of Texas School of Law. And ultimately, this case ruled that where there were not comparable programs for graduate or professional study at African American schools, HBCUs essentially, that predominantly white institutions or PWIs must allow African American students to enroll. And so that opened up graduate study, including in the School of Architecture for Mr. Chase. And within, I don't think it was even 2 weeks after the case ruling came down, he registered, enrolled at the University of Texas. And I think most of us have seen these images, most of which come from university publications. And the digital files are housed by the Briscoe Center. But in my research, I also located this photograph, as well as the image where he's standing in line behind the man and the woman in newspaper research. And he recalled getting a phone call from a reporter who was like, yeah, there's going to be a lot of people watching and a lot of press and reporters are there, so make sure you dress nice. And so that's why he was like decked out in this suit, and he even kind of like laughed at this tie that he was wearing that day. But as you can see, it was a very well documented moment. And to hear him talk about that experience as people are, like in queue at Gregory Auditorium, that's where registration. See, we're lucky we get to do all those things online now, but you had to go stand in line and wait and fill out all the forms and things. And during his studies, Mr. Chase, he recalls by and large, a positive experience. There were students who he made friends with, who he attended football games with. He did talk about, noticing that he was being followed, and so he wondered about, his safety until it was made he became aware that those were Secret Service following him for his protection initially. But living, in East Austin, there wasn't a place for him to sort of socialize or eat on campus, as would have been the case with other African American students. And Ms. Drucy talks about how she would drive up to the drag and drop him off and then pick him up in the afternoons. At the time, early in their marriage, they lived on East 22nd Street, right on the edge, actually, of the Rogers Washington Holy Cross Historic District, which is a neighborhood, as we'll see in a moment, where Chase ultimately designed several houses here in Austin. But ultimately, we know that Mr. Chase was successful in his graduate endeavors, and here we have a drawing. This is kind of our focal drawing on the drafting table out at the exhibition from his master's thesis completed in 1952 about progressive architecture for the Negro Baptist Church. And ultimately, this project became his calling card to advance his profession as an architect. It was rough going at first. He declined a position to head a School of Architecture at Prairie View A&M University, because basically that would mean that there would be graduate school at Prairie View, and so Black students wouldn't need to go to UT anymore. And so he did not want to prevent more African American students from having the opportunity that he had. And so he declined that position and instead took one to teach drafting at Texas Southern University in Houston. At that time, taking his thesis, he couldn't get employed by any white firms, even though there were various white architects who were guiding him and helping him on his road to becoming an architect, including serving as references for his applications to the AIA. And among the most kind of, I think, not startling, but just emotion filled, because there's just the moment that just like makes me mad, and then just like the triumphant moment are in his applications, which are in the online archives of the AIA. And so on the left, we have the first one, and I should have blown it up or highlighted it, but you can hear, because it's like received, reviewed, or something. And I have my glasses on, so I can't really see what this is. But then it says not granted. And this is his 1956 application. It wasn't that he wasn't qualified, and especially because he had permission to kind of not, he was working enough that he didn't have to fulfill the requirements of the formal internship because he couldn't get a job at a firm anyway. And so he passed his exams, but ultimately he was not initially admitted into the AIA for social reasons because it would not have been kosher for Mr. Chase to be socializing with white architects and their wives at events. Nevertheless, he still had support of many of his colleagues, and ultimately, 4 years later, got a call saying, hey, it's time, resubmit your application. And you can see here his 1960 application, which I think it was approved in like a day or two. And that really just kind of brought home some of the issues that Mr. Chase had to deal with during this time as he would travel in the Golden Triangle. So between Port Arthur, Beaumont, Orange, and Houston, that area, traveling to black churches in particular. He would meet the pastor on a Friday, basically, and be invited to service on Sunday. And in many churches, but definitely in black churches, all the visitors have to stand up and be recognized. And then they would stand up and folks would be like, hey, there's an architect. And we're talking about congregations with lawyers, doctors, educators, other civic leaders who needed architecture. I need a dentist's office. I need a house. I need an addition to my house. Kind of thing. And so he was able to develop a clientele that way. And so this particular period that I talk about in the book talks about those early days of Mr. Chase's career and then his retirement from Texas Southern University so that he could really embark on his career, including various projects for TSU, which of course it wouldn't have been ethical for him to pursue that work while he was a faculty member. But in that time, the family's traveling back and forth to Austin as well, visiting Ms. Drusey's family. This is one of my favorite pictures of Mr. and Mrs. Chase in the early years of their marriage, sitting on the sofa with Mrs. Rucker in her home. And then, of course, very well-known buildings here in Austin that Mr. Chase designed early on in his career, including David Chapel, Olivet Baptist Church, and David Chapel was among one of the first churches that he designed basically from the principles and tenets that he had established in his master's thesis. I think the Thompson and the Phillips residences are very well known here in Austin, designed for African-American women who were very prominent civic leaders here in Austin as well. And both of these homes are in the Rogers Washington Holy Cross, now historic district. And so the next chapter of the book will examine the expansion of Mr. Chase's firm, his rise to national prominence. Among topics covered will be his relationship with prominent African-American Houstonians in particular, designing for African-American religious and institutional groups for the beginnings of his involvement in nationally recognized commissions, as well as his achievements in the field of architecture and the profession through his 1977 election to the AIA's College of Fellows. And so here I've pictured a building from Tuskegee Institute that he worked on, as well as the Humanities Center at the bottom at TSU. He designed almost a dozen projects for TSU. And then in the middle, we have Estelle Gardens, which was a housing project. So a number of projects that are expanding his career, but really the foundation of this work in establishing modern architecture for African-American communities throughout Texas, but increasingly across the country during this part of his career. And then the next phase of his career in the next chapter of the book will document Mr. Chase's continued career and personal success. And among those events will be his return to Austin, you might call it, in the University of Texas as a distinguished alumnus, as the first African-American president of the Texas X's, working on several projects on or near campus, including the San Antonio parking garage. So I thought it was really serendipitous when I finally was able to get a permit to park in that garage. It's like, yeah! And I don't have to park in the East Campus garage anymore and take 2 shuttles to get to Goldsmith. And also the Mike Myers soccer and track stadium as well, and just his contributions to the campus's physical development. I felt were sort of nice denouement in his career, and that return to Austin in this way. And ultimately, Mr. Chase retired from practice in 2006. And so the concluding chapter will really serve as, an assessment of Mr. Chase's contributions to American history, how he incorporated involvement with various social, civic, and political groups to expand not only his personal but also professional agendas as an architect. And so for me, Mr. Chase's life and career is really about providing, accessible modernism to the middle class in general, but certainly to middle class African Americans throughout the United States, really focusing on aspects of community and connection by his work with other African American men like Mr. Buckley, who were also seeking professional, careers as architects, builders like Oliver B. Street, who was a really prominent builder here in Austin, and several of Mr. Chase's designs were ultimately built by Mr. Street, including Olivet and David Chapel churches. His relationship with the Lott family, and in preparing the exhibition, especially the panels on the School of Architecture's precursors. I reached out to Ted Gordon, who had been working, Dr. Ted Gordon, on the Campus Contextualization Initiative, just to say, hey, as a kind of additional extension of this work on campus builders and building history and architecture. And I'm including these panels on the precursors. And he's like, this is great. And we're talking. And he's like, we need to meet really quickly. And I was like, okay. And we had a Zoom, and he basically told me about another early student, Mr. Virgil Lott, who was a member of the Lott family, and essentially would have been inspired as a teenager by Mr. Chase, who's working in his family's firm. And you can see Mr. Lott's picture there. And so, illuminating some of these stories and just understanding the significant legacy that Mr. Chase left us, not only here in the School of Architecture in opening that door for African American students, but giving us continued work to do with Professor Heyman's book and look at the Chase residents. Professor Isabella Knuckles' students last semester did paint analysis of several Chase buildings in Houston. My students' mapping work, and a quote that the students who engaged in that project presented with their work is here. I'm not going to read it, and I did read it at the opening exhibition, but really understanding how important, community was for Mr. Chase and his career. And in a 2008 interview with KUT, Mr. Chase said, quote, "I want the minority kids, the Black kids, to be able to see that there is something else to be done." And he was referencing his decision to retain his architectural practice in the 3rd Ward of Houston, in a predominantly African American neighborhood, essentially the same neighborhood where Texas Southern University is, adjacent to the more upper middle class neighborhood where he and his family resided. But he wanted youth, and people in general, to have that same moment of interaction, and that light bulb moment where perhaps walking past an architectural firm owned and operated by a Black man would make them realize that they too could do this kind of work. So definitely retaining his practice in that location as opposed to a lucrative high rise in downtown Houston was his goal, and realizing, wanting children of color especially to know that they could become architects too, to know that there's something else to be done for their opportunities for personal and educational advancement. And so it's been quite an honor and a journey to do this work and to continue this work. and Mr. Chase's legacy in this way, which will only be, I hope, a stepping stone for further research, because even though I'm a perfectionist procrastinator, it's time to get her done. And so, because when's the book coming out? That question of the moment. And so just really having, the opportunity to do this research and present it for everyone, especially now in these days and times. And, Mr. Chase's life story is really emblematic of the struggle of many African Americans. He fought for access and equality in education, in the professional and his personal accomplishments. And his life and career really show and reflect how, the more of a widespread inclusion of African Americans in the formation of the built environment, the importance of telling their stories and their narratives as creators, as inhabitants, and knowing that there is still something else to be done. So if you haven't had the opportunity to visit the exhibition in our buildings here in the School of Architecture, please do so in the north and south lobbies of this building, as well as exhibitions of some of our student work in Sutton. Brent Humphrey's photographs of Mr. Chase's Austin projects on the 4th floor of West Mall building. And on April, I was about to say August, I don't know why, April 26th, in conjunction with the Preservation Austin Tour of Homes, hey ladies, I will lead tours of the Keystone Edition, which was a lot construction company development on Graham Street that Chase designed while he was working there. And this year is not only the centennial of Mr. Chase's birth, but also the 125th anniversary of the Sweat v. Painter ruling, and therefore the 125th anniversary of Mr. Chase's enrollment at the University of Texas as well. So over the next few years, we'll have several milestones in his life and career to continue to celebrate, and I invite you to do that with me. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions, so let's open it up.
Ask away. Yes.
I saw one of the photographs, I think, where Mr. and Mrs. Chase in front of the Arno Nowotny building on...
That's the San Antonio garage.
No, not that one.
Yes.
Do you know what the story is?
I think this one is on the occasion of the naming of the campus, is the Sweat campus, and he was, if not president, then involved in alumni activity at that time.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, my name's Heidi. I feel like something I remember from maybe 5 or 6 years ago was that the St. David Chapel was going to be demolished. Didn't it come up for demolition? And maybe that was even somehow.
So I don't think the church has ever come up for demolition. The church has acquired a significant piece of property further in East Austin for the construction of a new church.
Right.
They have not moved yet. And I actually had one of my students last semester tell me that as a result of me talking about Mr. Chase in the chapel, he started going to services there, which is really cool. And the church has, they understand the importance and the significance of the building. So they would they're not, ready to sell the property to a developer tomorrow. And so we really don't know what's going to be happening with David Chapel in the immediate future, but there are no plans to demolish it. I do remember that period when there was a lot of press because the church had acquired this property and they were talking about moving and they wanted to sell the property. But that has not yet happened.
Yeah, I will just be curious to see how that goes.
Me too.
It's an intersection of a lot of different things.
Yes. Yes.
Dr. Dudley, thank you so much for your presentation and uplifting of John Chase and his incredible impact not only in Austin but throughout Central Texas and East Texas and elsewhere. I was curious, I appreciate you talking about there were definitely white allies in support for him as a contributor to the field of architecture, but were there other white field?
At that time, within the field of architecture, if we're talking about the 50s when he's first starting his career, not so much. Definitely by the time we have a larger cohort of architects of color in organizations like the American Institute, the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, is when you have that moment of recognition and mobility. Hey, let's do something. Because there are lots of things that I left out. But in 1971, Mr. Chase was among a group of minority architects who met at the AIA convention in Detroit. It's Detroit or Denver. It starts with a D. I think it's Detroit. And ultimately came together to form what we know of now as the National Organization of Minority Architects for the advancement of, architectural study, education for African Americans, but also understanding, hey, we need to come together because even, at the tail end of the civil rights movement, we're not getting the partnerships and the jobs and the contracts that we could be getting that we're qualified to get. So what can we do as practitioners collectively to make those changes? Thank you.
I have another question. I'm curious, what happened to him and Buckley's relationship? It's more interpersonal.
I don't know. I think, well, I don't think it was anything personal that happened because in actually research that I've done in the last couple of weeks, because like the same thing, I was like, what happened to Mr. Buckley? They remained not maybe close friends, but in contact. I could sense that. But one thing that I discovered in a newspaper article is that, when the door became open for African Americans to apply to the university, Buckley also applied. But whereas Mr. Chase was admitted, Buckley was not. And there were a couple of other individuals as well, and in different programs, whether it's physics or whatnot, because like, of course, the press is all over this. And so they're talking about, these people, these black folks applied to the university and, here's who got in and here's who didn't, kind of thing. And so he did apply, but was not, I think Mr. Chase's background at Hampton and the work he'd been doing, although Mr. Buckley's was very similar because he went to Tuskegee, he was working here with Mr. Chase. So the reasoning behind him not being admitted, I'm not sure. But he moved to the East Coast and became an educator and nevertheless, very civically involved in his community as well. So yeah, you're welcome.
I have a bunch of questions.
Go for it.
I mean, one thing I'm interested in is like how you go from your first book to like this type of book, which is it must have just had
Which is
so many
also
different types of changes you had to make just to research.
Oh yeah, and making that shift was one thing, and Chris Long will tell you because my book is an outcome of my dissertation, and so I graduated in 2012, and the book was published in 2021. So it's just that like that kind of thinking, even though that was like a done thing, and I was definitely very optimistic and ambitious, especially wanting to do this for the Chase family and knowing that Miss Juicy was older, wanting to finish this. And I think initially we were like, we're going to get this done in 2 years. Yeah, no. The pandemic and life had other things, but just overall, a similar methodology in trying to figure out the source material because it's there, but just understanding what source material I needed to access to answer the questions that I had. What else did he build aside from these 12 projects? So where can I find that information? And being able to look for that by, like looking in the Houston Public Library's Excel spreadsheet of all the drawings that they do have. So that was one source of doing that in addition to the AIA records, journal articles and thing. And basically scrolling through it and revisiting a lot of those resources, listening to what Mr. Chase was saying. For example, in the interviews, and in particular the one with Greg Smith and two of his students, where he's talking about, I worked for the lot construction company and I worked for them and was designing some of the houses for a development that they were building that you could see from Rosewood Park, and it was near the city incinerator. And I was like, what? And so I just started doing all this like Google research and pulling all the Sanborns. And first of all, there's no incinerator over there. So what's that all about? But then finding that there was, one on the Sanborn, and then, process of elimination and some newspaper research on what the Lott family was doing, and finding this Keystone Edition, this neighborhood on Graham Street, and most of those houses are still quite intact and look a lot like they did when the construction company built them, and essentially John Chase designed them. And so revisiting those sources, which is in a way very similar to the methodology that I did with my book. We're just in the 20th century as opposed to the 19th century. You're welcome.
Another thing I'm interested in is, because I've never written this, like written anything kind of like about a single character.
Mm-hmm.
It seems kind of terrifying to me.
It's absolutely terrifying because I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to do it wrong. And I mean, and he's just so important, and his significance has not been appreciated until fairly recently in a major way. So I was going to say something, but I'm going to like shoot myself in the back. I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say it.
I wonder, how do you balance, like, I guess on one hand, like, why did you choose to do it chronologically?
Mm-hmm.
And then, how do you balance, like, the biographical, right, with, like, art school?
Sure.
Or, like, and I don't even care about the distinctions,
Mm-hmm.
I'm more interested in the biography.
I was thinking, it's harder for me, and I think many people, maybe, I don't know, you do a really good job, like, thematically stuff. You're like, what? Put me on the spot. No, seriously. I'm just very, like, chronological minded. My students will tell you, like, before every lecture, there's, like, a timeline, like, literally. You're like, yep. And so, but doing it that way made it easier for me to interweave those stories. And with a story like Mr. Chase's, where what he was doing as an architect is just so much like tied to his personal life and his career, his relationship with the communities, wherever he's living, with his colleagues, just kind of helped that to flow. The harder thing for me has been because like I'm a 19th century historian, and like the one thing that I was terrified about the most for when I did my comps was like modern architecture. And I was like terrified that Anthony Olofsson was gonna ask me some question about modern architecture. I'm not even joking. And so like making that sort of switch and looking at buildings a little bit differently. But for me, it's become also thanks to some coaching from my colleagues and like not even having to completely like explicate or describe every building. It's the broader context. And I'll leave it to my students and other people to be like all specific about, like Stephen Fox is good at that. So he can do like the hardcore architectural analysis of buildings. And I say this now, and I'm gonna go home this weekend and like be like driving myself crazy over trying to look at some building. But, thinking about it that way, but it's just really, I think for me in telling the stories of various marginalized communities and understanding that their architectural endeavors, if you will, are just so closely tied to a desire for, parity, for equality in so many ways. And so we see that in what, they're commissioning, what they're building, in their communities in so many ways. It just makes it really easy. And I think, whether I'm talking about women in my work, Black communities from different time periods, it's so much tied to that community identity in addition to personal agency in a way that I think really is this is being recorded, right? Like, because this needs to go in my my research statement and my scholarship statement, because that sounded like pretty decent. That's really at the foundation of what I do. And so ultimately, this is very different subject matter, but the way that I think about it is almost the same.
Oh, well, that's a beautiful thought to end on.
I know,
And
right?
put that at the start of the book. Oh my gosh.
Okay, good. Just like verbatim.
That's good. thank you, Tara.
You're
That was
very
really
much.
wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.